The ancient rope bridge swayed in the fierce Arizona wind, its weathered planks hanging by threads over the vast canyon. The townsfolk gathered at the edge, faces etched with worry as they stared at the impossible crossing. Among them stood Tall Hawk, an Apache scout whose eyes remained fixed on the distant figure huddled on the far rim. She was there, the settler woman whose life he had saved seasons ago, now stranded by those who had promised her safe passage. Would he risk everything to reach her when no one else dared try? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Whispering Pines rested uneasily on the edge of Apache territory in the Arizona of 1885. Not quite civilization, not quite wilderness. A place of dust, determination, and deeply drawn lines. The main street consisted of the essential buildings: a general store, a saloon that doubled as the town meeting hall, a small church, and the sheriff's office. Beyond these stretched modest homes, their windows like watchful eyes staring out at the harsh landscape. Tall Hawk moved through town like a shadow at dusk. He was neither welcomed nor openly shunned, merely tolerated for his unmatched skills as a tracker. The Apache Scout services were considered necessary by the same people who would never invite him to sit at their tables. His buckskins were well worn but meticulously maintained, much like the careful composure he wore on his weathered face. "Injun," muttered a cowhand outside the saloon, just loud enough to be heard. "Wonder what he's doin' in town again." Tall Hawk gave no indication he'd heard. His hand instinctively brushed the medicine pouch at his waist. A small, worn leather sack containing herbs and tokens that connected him to a heritage these townsfolk would never understand. 28 summers had taught him when to fight and when to let words drift away like smoke. "Sheriff wants to see you," called Hank from the general store's porch, the only man in town who addressed him directly without a request for tracking services. "Said it's important." With a slight nod, Tall Hawk adjusted his course toward the sheriff's office. As he walked, his thoughts drifted to the woman whose face had appeared in his dreams 3 nights running, Elizabeth Winters, the schoolteacher with eyes the color of the sky after rain. He had first encountered her 2 springs ago, when she'd ventured too far from town gathering wildflowers. A diamondback had been sunning itself on the very rock she reached for. Tall Hawk had been gathering medicine plants nearby and moved without thinking, pulling her back just as the snake struck. The bite caught him on the forearm instead. "You're hurt," she had said, her voice steady despite her fear. Not savage or Indian, or any of the other names he regularly heard, just concern for his wound. He had wordlessly opened his medicine pouch, applied a poultice to the bite, and tried to leave. "Wait," she had called after him. "At least tell me your name, so I can thank you properly." "Tall Hawk," he had answered, surprised at himself for replying. Their paths had crossed with increasing frequency after that day. She would be gathering plants for her students, and he would appear like a spirit from the juniper trees. Each time he showed her which plants healed and which harmed. Each time she taught him words from her books. Neither spoke of these meetings to others, a shared secret in a place where such friendships invited scorn. Sheriff Davis was waiting outside his office, hat pushed back on his graying head. "Got trouble across the canyon," he said without preamble. Telegraph came in from New Prospect Settlement. Cut off mid-message. "What kind of trouble?" Tall Hawk asked, his voice low and measured. "Don't rightly know. Something about raiders." The sheriff spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Mentioned injuries. Storm washed out the bridge 3 days back, so there's no way across till it's repaired." A cold weight settled in Tall Hawk's chest. Elizabeth had taken a teaching position in New Prospect just before the last full moon. She had told him of her plans during their final meeting, promising to return when the school term ended. "When will repairs begin?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. The sheriff laughed without humor. "Town council says not till next month at earliest. Too dangerous with the spring floods. Canyons unstable." Tall Hawk's hand once again found the medicine pouch at his waist. Inside was a small blue ribbon Elizabeth had once used to tie back her hair. She had given it to him as a token before leaving, a piece of herself to carry with him. "I will go," he said simply. Sheriff Davis stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Bridge is gone, son. Just splinters and rope now. Nobody's crossing that death trap." But Tall Hawk was already walking away, his mind calculating what he would need. In his thoughts, he could see Elizabeth waiting, perhaps wounded, certainly in danger. Some bridges, he knew, existed long before they were built, like the one between two souls from different worlds. Behind him, he heard the sheriff call out to others gathering nearby. "You hear that? Injun says he's gonna cross the canyon. He's crazy to cross that crumbling bridge." By sunset, half the town had heard of Tall Hawk's intention. They gathered at Dawson's saloon, their voices rising with the amber glow of whiskey. "Fool's errand," declared Jake Reynolds, the sheriff's deputy and self-appointed voice of reason. "That bridge was barely holding before the storm. Now it's just splinters and prayers." Tall Hawk stood silently at the back, listening. He had come to gather information, not to debate. On a table near the center of the room lay a coil of broken telegraph wire, the last physical connection to the settlement across the canyon, severed mid-message. Mayor Thompson unfolded a paper with trembling hands. "This is what came through before it cut off. Raiders attacked settlement, stop 5 wounded, stop winter supplies stolen, stop schoolmistress Elise." He looked up gravely. "That's all we got. Elizabeth." The name hammered in Tall Hawk's chest like a war drum. "We need to organize a proper rescue," insisted Peter Williams, the storekeeper. "Go around the canyon pass. That's 3 days' ride each way," the sheriff countered. "By then, whoever's wounded could be dead." "So what do you propose?" Jake challenged, staring directly at Tall Hawk. "That we let this Apache try some fool crossing and likely die himself? Then what good is he to anyone?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the tall figure in the shadows. "I have crossed worse," Tall Hawk said simply. "Not this canyon," Jake scoffed. "Not with half the bridge gone. My people crossed this land before bridges existed." Tall Hawk stepped forward, his voice low but carrying. "We know how to read what the earth tells us. And what's your interest in this, exactly?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "Why risk your neck for settlers?" A dangerous question. Tall Hawk had been careful to keep his friendship with Elizabeth private. Any hint of deeper feelings would only fuel the suspicions already burning in eyes like Jake's. "I track. I scout. This is what you value me for." He gestured to the broken telegraph wire. "Now there is tracking to be done." The mayor cleared his throat. "The town council cannot sanction such a dangerous attempt. If you try this crossing, you do so against our advisement and at your own risk." "Noted," Tall Hawk replied. He had never expected their blessing. Later, as stars pierced the darkness, Tall Hawk stood at the canyon's edge. The wind carried the scent of sage and stone. Below, the river gleamed like a silver snake, swollen with spring melt. Across the vast gap, the new Prospect settlement was marked only by a few distant lights. "They say you're going." The voice behind him belonged to Wise Raven, the medicine man who had taught Tall Hawk the old ways when his own father fell in the wars against the Bluecoats. "She is there," Tall Hawk answered, knowing no further explanation was needed. Wise Raven knew of Elizabeth, though they had never spoken of her directly. The old man joined him at the edge. His face, lined like the canyon walls themselves, revealed nothing. "The bridge speaks of death to those without eyes to see. But there are always paths for those who understand the language of the land." From his robe, Wise Raven produced a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. "Tobacco for the canyon spirits, sage for clear thinking, bare root for strength." Tall Hawk accepted the offering with both hands, honoring the gift. "The woman," Wise Raven said, his dark eyes reflecting starlight, "she carries your heart across the divide." It wasn't a question, and Tall Hawk didn't deny it. "The townsfolk are right about one thing," the old man continued. "The crossing is foolish by their wisdom." A rare smile crossed his weathered face. "But our people have always known that some foolishness is sacred." As dawn approached, Tall Hawk prepared his few supplies. a coil of rawhide rope over one shoulder, a knife, water, the medicine bundle from Wise Raven. Nothing more would serve him on the crossing. From his window, he could see townsfolk already gathering at the canyon edge, come to witness what they believed would be either a miracle or a suicide. Their doubt hung in the air like morning mist. He thought of Elizabeth's face, the determined set of her jaw when she spoke of teaching children from both sides of the cultural divide, the soft smile that appeared only when they were alone, the courage that had brought her west when grief might have anchored her to the past. If she was wounded, waiting, every moment mattered. Tall Hawk stepped outside, the rising sun warming his face. Behind him, someone whispered loud enough to hear, "You're crazy to cross that crumbling bridge." The words followed him like shadows as he walked toward the canyon's edge. The canyon opened before Tall Hawk like the mouth of a great beast. Morning light revealed what darkness had hidden, the true extent of the damage. The bridge, once a sturdy construction of timber and rope, now resembled the skeleton of some ancient creature, picked clean by the storm's fury. Several main support ropes remained, sagging dangerously. Perhaps a third of the wooden slats still clung to the structure, most visibly rotted or cracked. From his shoulder, Tall Hawk unwound his most valuable tool, a 40-foot length of rawhide rope he had prepared through the night. Unlike the town's manila ropes, rawhide became stronger when wet, a knowledge passed down through generations of Apache who had navigated these lands long before settlers arrived. "This is madness," Sheriff Davis said, approaching from behind. "No man can cross that." Tall Hawk continued his assessment without turning. "Not as it stands now." "Then you admit it's impossible?" "I said not as it stands." Tall Hawk finally faced the lawman. "It must be rebuilt while crossing." The sheriff's eyebrows rose toward his hat brim. "Rebuild it? While you're on it?" Tall Hawk nodded once. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "The strongest bridges are built by those with the courage to stand where nothing yet exists." 20 summers ago, his father had shown him how to navigate narrow passages using rawhide and knowledge of knots. "Apache have crossed canyons since before the Spanish brought horses," he had said. "When there is need, we find a way." The need now was Elizabeth. Tall Hawk turned back to his preparations, testing the strength of his rawhide coil with calloused hands. "Wait!" called a voice. Peter Williams, the storekeeper, hurried forward. In his arms, he carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "If you're determined to try this fool thing, you might as well have proper tools." Inside the bundle lay coils of thinner rawhide strips, a set of steel hooks, and a small hatchet. "My brother was a mountain man up Colorado way," Peter explained, avoiding the stares of other townsfolk. "Said these were the best for high places." Tall Hawk accepted the gift with a nod of respect. "My thanks." "Don't thank me," Peter muttered. "Just don't die out there. And if you make it across." He hesitated, glancing around before continuing quietly. "Miss Winters is a fine woman. She taught my boy his letters when no one else had the patience." So, Tall Hawk thought, he wasn't the only one who had noticed Elizabeth's kindness. As the sun climbed higher, Jake Reynolds pushed through the growing crowd. "This is still town property," he announced, gesturing toward the bridge remains. "And I say this is reckless endangerment." "Nobody's asking you to go out there," someone called from the crowd. Jake's face reddened. "It's not about me. It's about order. We wait for proper repairs or we go around the long way. We don't let an Apache risk bringing down what's left of our bridge." "Our bridge?" Peter challenged. "Seems to me a bridge belongs to anyone brave enough to cross it." The argument might have escalated, but Tall Hawk had already tuned them out. His focus narrowed to the task ahead as he secured the tools about his person. Each placement was deliberate, knife at his belt, coil of primary rawhide over one shoulder, smaller tools distributed where they would balance his weight. Last came Wise Raven's medicine bundle and Elizabeth's blue ribbon, both placed in the leather pouch at his waist. From another pocket, he removed a single eagle feather, a gift from Wise Raven for protection. He slid it into his hair, feeling the weight of his people's traditions settle upon him. The crossing would require everything he had learned in 28 summers. Balance, strength, patience, and the wisdom to read what the canyon would tell him. One misstep meant death on the rocks below. "I still say you're crazy," the sheriff said, but his tone had softened. "But I've seen crazy men do impossible things before." Tall Hawk secured the last of his preparations. He looked across the canyon toward the settlement, thinking of Elizabeth. Was she watching even now? Could she see him preparing to come for her? The crowd had grown larger, their murmurs like the buzzing of bees. Some had come to witness a miracle, others to see a man fall to his death. Tall Hawk cared for neither audience. His purpose stood on the far side of the divide. With a final check of his rawhide rope, the lifeline that would either deliver him to Elizabeth or fail them both, Tall Hawk approached the edge where the bridge began. Behind him, the whispers continued. "You're crazy to cross that crumbling bridge." He stepped onto the first plank, feeling it shift beneath his weight. The journey had begun. The first 10 feet of bridge remained mostly intact, though the planks groaned under Tall Hawk's careful steps. He moved with deliberate precision, testing each board before committing his weight. The eagle feather in his hair stirred in the morning breeze, a reminder of wise Raven's faith. Behind him, the crowd had fallen silent. Even Jake Reynolds watched with grudging attention. Death held no allegiance to race or creed, and all present understood they were witnessing something remarkable, whether it ended in triumph or tragedy. Tall Hawk reached the first major gap where 3 consecutive planks had been torn away by the storm. Below, the river churned hungrily, its voice a constant roar that seemed to call his name. He knelt, securing his position on the last stable board, and assessed the damage. The main support ropes remained, though slack and weathered. Tall Hawk reached for the smaller rawhide strips from Peter's bundle. With practiced hands, he fashioned a temporary harness, looping it around the main rope and his waist. Not enough to hold if he fell, but sufficient to stabilize him for what came next. He thought of Elizabeth teaching him to read from a book of poetry she carried. "Words are bridges too," she had told him. "They cross the spaces between minds, between hearts." Now, 20 feet out, suspended above certain death, Tall Hawk moved as if reading the language of the bridge itself. Each creak, each sway told him where strength remained and where weakness lurked. He fashioned a makeshift pulley using one of Peter's steel hooks, then fed his main rawhide rope through it. With this system, he could swing out, secure a new connection, and advance without placing full weight on the damaged section. The first swing took him 3 feet beyond the gap. He latched onto a still solid section of the support rope, quickly wrapping his rawhide around it in a pattern his father had called the spider's embrace. The knot would hold even if the wood beneath him gave way. A whisper of movement caught his eye, something on the distant shore. Through the haze of morning light, Tall Hawk glimpsed a figure emerging from the trees near the settlement. Though too far to see clearly, he knew with certainty it was Elizabeth. His heart quickened. She was alive. "Look there!" someone shouted from the town side. "Someone's alive over there." The knowledge that eyes watched from both sides neither helped nor hindered. Tall Hawk's world had narrowed to the few feet around him. The next handhold, the next step, the next breath. He had covered nearly a third of the distance when he encountered the first sign of deliberate damage. A support rope had been partially cut, not torn by natural forces. The clean edge was unmistakable. Tall Hawk froze, understanding blooming like a storm cloud. The bridge hadn't simply failed during the flood. Someone had weakened it intentionally. The raiders who attacked the settlement had ensured no help could come quickly. This changed everything. What other sabotage might await? He would need to test each section with even greater care. Using his knife, Tall Hawk cut away the damaged portion of rope and spliced in a section of his own rawhide. The repair wouldn't last through another storm, but it would hold for the crossing if the spirits were kind. 50 feet out now, the bridge began to sway more severely. The wind had picked up, whistling through the canyon walls, speaking of coming weather. Tall Hawk glanced at the sky, clear now, but clouds gathered on the western horizon. He needed to move faster. Another gap appeared, larger than the first. 5 planks missing, with support ropes hanging in loops beneath where the walkway should be. This would require a different approach. Tall Hawk secured himself to the main support rope, then lowered his body to hang beneath the bridge structure. Now he moved like the spiders that inspired his knots, crawling along the underside of the bridge frame. Each movement was measured, each grip tested before he released the previous one. From below, the bridge revealed new secrets. More cut ropes, deliberate weakening at key structural points. This was the work of men who understood how to ensure the bridge would fail when stressed. The townsfolk's voices had faded to nothing now. He was too far out to hear them. There was only the wind, the creaking wood, and the river's constant challenge below. When he reached the far side of the gap, Tall Hawk pulled himself up onto the walkway again. As he did, a weathered plank snapped beneath his hand. For a heart-stopping moment, he dangled by one arm, feet swinging over the abyss. With a grunt of effort, he pulled himself up, rolling onto a more solid section. Taking a moment to breathe, he looked ahead. Still 2/3 of the crossing remained, and the worst was yet to come. On the far shore, the figure had moved closer to the bridge's end. Elizabeth. She was limping but standing, waiting for him. That sight alone gave him strength to continue. The eagle feather trembled in his hair as if sharing his determination. Tall Hawk rose and faced the next challenge. Halfway across the canyon, disaster struck. A support rope that had appeared solid suddenly unraveled when tested, sending a section of bridge collapsing beneath Tall Hawk's feet. He plummeted, a cry torn from his throat despite years of practiced stoicism. His fall stopped with a violent jerk as his safety harness caught on a remaining crossbeam. The impact drove the breath from his lungs. For several seconds, he hung suspended, swinging like a pendant above the churning river. From both shores came distant shouts. Concern from the settlement side, horror from the town. Neither mattered now, only survival. When his vision cleared, Tall Hawk found himself dangling near the canyon wall, close enough to touch the weathered stone. As he steadied himself, his gaze fell upon something unexpected. Faint red markings on the rock face, partially revealed by a recent rockslide. Ancient pictographs drawn by Apache hands generations before. The images showed human figures crossing the canyon on what appeared to be a rope bridge. Among them, a symbol Tall Hawk recognized immediately, the spiral that represented life's journey. His people had crossed here long before any wooden bridge existed. They had found their way when there seemed to be none. Using his legs to propel himself closer to the wall, Tall Hawk examined the stone surface. What the townsfolk saw as sheer cliff, his trained eye recognized as a series of natural handholds, a path invisible to those who didn't know how to look. With renewed purpose, Tall Hawk detached his harness from the dangling bridge section and secured it to a protruding rock. Hand over hand, he began traversing the canyon wall itself. The ancient pictographs continued along his path, revealed in fragments where erosion had not claimed them. Warriors, animals, the symbols for water and sky, and repeatedly the spiral, the journey. Above, an eagle circled, its shadow passing over him like a blessing. His father had once told him that eagles were messengers between this world and the spirit realm. They see the path when we cannot, he had said. 20 minutes of painstaking progress along the wall brought Tall Hawk to a ledge wide enough to rest upon. From this vantage point, he could see both shores clearly. On the town side, people had gathered in larger numbers, pointing and gesturing. On the settlement side, Elizabeth had managed to move closer, her limping figure now unmistakable. He needed to rejoin what remained of the bridge structure, still hanging some 15 feet away from the wall. This would require a leap of faith, literally. Tall Hawk unwound his remaining length of rawhide, fashioned a grappling hook using one of Peter's steel implements, and tested its weight. He would have one chance to catch the bridge frame. The wind had picked up considerably, howling through the canyon like angry spirits. Dark clouds now loomed overhead, promising rain before day's end. Time was running short. Tall Hawk closed his eyes briefly, feeling the presence of the ancient ones who had left their marks on these walls. They too had faced the crossing. They too had found a way. He swung the makeshift grappling hook in a wide arc, released it with perfect timing, and watched it sail across the gap. It caught on the bridge frame with a solid thunk. 3 sharp tugs confirmed it would hold. Now came the dangerous part. Securing one end of the rawhide to the rock ledge created a diagonal line across the empty space. It would not bear his full weight for long, but it might allow him to cross if he moved quickly enough. Using the smaller strips of rawhide, Townsfolk fashioned a handle that would slide along the main rope. With this, he could hang beneath the line and pull himself across the gap hand over hand. Before beginning, he touched the ancient pictographs one last time. "I see your path," he whispered in Apache. "I honor your guidance." Then he launched himself from the ledge, sliding rapidly down the rawhide line toward the dangling bridge section. The rope stretched alarmingly, dropping him lower with each foot traveled. By the time he reached the bridge frame, he was merely feet above the river's hungry reach. With a final surge of strength, Townsfolk pulled himself onto a relatively intact section of bridge. The structure swayed dangerously under his weight, but held. Looking back at the canyon wall, he could now see the pictographs in their entirety, generations of his people, finding ways across impossible divides. Not just a physical crossing, but a spiritual one. Ahead lay the final third of his journey, the section most exposed to the elements. The wood here was sun-bleached and weather-worn, even before the flood damage. On the far shore, Elizabeth had managed to reach the bridge's anchor point. She stood supporting herself with a makeshift crutch, one hand raised in greeting or warning. He couldn't tell which. The first fat raindrops began to fall as thunder rumbled overhead. The coming storm would make an already dangerous crossing nearly impossible. Townsfolk rose to his feet, checked his remaining supplies, and continued forward. The Ancient Ones had shown him their path. Now he would forge his own. Rain fell in earnest as Townsfolk navigated the final stretch of broken bridge. The storm had arrived with unexpected ferocity, turning the canyon into a chamber of howling wind and stinging droplets. His hands, raw from hours of climbing and rope work, struggled to maintain their grip on the slick wood and fiber. Through the curtain of rain, Elizabeth's figure remained at the far end, a beacon drawing him forward. She had found shelter beneath a stone overhang but refused to retreat further, keeping vigil as he fought his way toward her. With a final search, as he mapped out his second target, the row of medicine bottles lined Elizabeth Morrison's bedside table like silent sentinels, amber glass containing tinctures, tonics, and powders from the finest apothecary in Denver. Dr. Wilson had expressed amazement at her improvement when he visited last week, attributing it to the expensive new treatments that Samuel had somehow managed to procure. A miracle, the doctor had called it, not knowing the true source of the miracle was stolen gold. Samuel arranged the latest bottle among the others, this one containing a European respiratory compound that had required special ordering. His mother watched him from her bed, eyes narrowed with the same unspoken questions she'd been harboring for weeks. "The ranch is paid up through December," Samuel said, changing the subject before she could ask. "And I settled Thomas Jenkins' feed bill yesterday. Odd jobs for Jacob Whitley don't pay that well," Elizabeth observed, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Nor does selling eggs." Samuel busied himself straightening the quilt across her lap. "I've been breaking horses for the Peterson spread too. $3 a head." The lie hung between them as substantial as the medicine bottles. Elizabeth reached out to touch her son's wrist, stilling his nervous movement. "Samuel," she said quietly, "whatever you're doing to keep this roof over our heads, be careful." Her eyes held his, communicating both gratitude and concern. "I'm getting stronger every day. Soon I'll be able to." "You'll rest and get well," Samuel interrupted gently. "That's all you need to worry about." In town, excitement over the boy bandit had only intensified after the second robbery. 2 weeks ago, a Kansas Pacific payroll train had been hit using the same method. A single young man with a bandana mask, a well-planned ambush at a remote curve, and another calling card left behind. This time, the newspapers reported a take of nearly $6,000. Samuel moved carefully through Silver Creek, head down, ears open. The Marshall and Pinkerton detective remained in town, their frustration growing with each passing day. They'd questioned every railroad worker in 3 counties, reviewed passenger manifests, and posted rewards for information, all without result. At Whitley's store, Emma cornered him in the storage room, her eyes bright with excitement. "Did you hear? They say Kid Ghost might be a railroad worker's son, seeking revenge." She held up the latest edition of the Denver Post. The second train he robbed was from the same company that denied compensation after that bridge collapse last year. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. "Is that so?" The marshal thinks the robberies are personal, targeting companies with histories of mistreating workers. Emma leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They're making a list of workers who died in railroad accidents, checking if their families have suddenly come into money." Samuel kept his expression neutral, though alarm bells rang in his mind. "Sounds like they're grasping at straws." "Maybe." Emma studied him with unusual intensity. "You know, you're about the same age as they say the Kid Ghost is." "Half the young men in the territory are," Samuel replied evenly. "Besides, I was here the night of both robberies." "Were you?" Emma challenged softly. "No one saw you after dark either time." Before Samuel could respond, Jacob Whitley called for his daughter from the front of the store. Emma held Samuel's gaze a moment longer, then turned and left without another word. That evening, as Samuel rode home, he spotted riders approaching the Morrison ranch, the marshal and detective, accompanied by the county sheriff. Cold dread pooled in his stomach. He urged Chief into a trot, reaching the house just as the men were dismounting. "Samuel Morrison?" Marshal Hayes called, his hand resting casually near his holster. "Yes, sir," Samuel replied, keeping his voice steady. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about your whereabouts during the recent train robberies." Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "My son was home with me both evenings, Marshal. I can vouch for that." Hayes exchanged glances with the Pinkerton detective. "Ma'am, we have information suggesting otherwise." "What information?" Samuel asked, dismounting slowly. "Let's talk inside," Detective Carter suggested, his thin smile not reaching his eyes. The questioning lasted over an hour. They knew Thomas Morrison had worked for the Denver and Rio Grande. They knew about his death and the denied compensation. They'd noted the recent payment of the Morrisons' bank loan and Elizabeth's improved health due to expensive medicines. What they didn't have was proof. No witnesses who could place Samuel at either robbery. No stolen money found on the property during their cursory search. No connection to the distinctive SM calling cards. "Your father died in a railroad accident," Hayes said finally, watching Samuel's face closely. "That must have made you angry." "Yes, sir," Samuel answered truthfully, "but not angry enough to become an outlaw." After they left, Elizabeth sat heavily in her rocking chair, her breathing labored from the stress. "They'll be back," she said simply. Samuel nodded, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a physical force. The authorities were getting closer. The next robbery would be even riskier. But the medicine bottles on his mother's table reminded him why he couldn't stop now. Emma's blue hair ribbon fluttered in Samuel's saddlebag as he crouched behind the stand of scrub pine, watching the Union Pacific freight crawl up the steep grade. She'd given it to him yesterday. "For luck," she'd said, her eyes holding his a moment too long. He wasn't sure when Emma had figured out his secret, but something in her manner had shifted from suspicion to silent complicity. Samuel touched the ribbon briefly before pulling the bandana over his face. This would be his most dangerous robbery yet. After the Kansas Pacific job, the railroads had begun coordinating security, doubling guards on payroll shipments and posting armed men at vulnerable points along the routes. Tonight's target carried less money than previous shipments, but the Union Pacific had recently forced 3 of his father's old friends into early retirement without pensions after a management change. Some debts weren't measured in. Turning it slowly in his fingers. Though damaged, the engraving remained visible. Whispering Pines County. "This belongs to Sheriff Davis," he said, the realization settling like cold stone in his stomach. Not precisely, Elizabeth corrected. Look at the number on the back. Tall Hawk turned the badge over. The number 2 was stamped into the metal. Deputy's badge, he said. Jake Reynolds. Elizabeth nodded grimly. Jake courted me when I first arrived in Whispering Pines. When I declined his proposal, he became difficult. I took the teaching position across the canyon partly to distance myself from his unwanted attentions. The pieces aligned in Tall Hawk's mind, Jake's vehement opposition to any rescue attempt, his suspicious questioning about Tall Hawk's motives, the sabotaged bridge. Did you recognize him among the raiders? Tall Hawk asked. No, they wore kerchiefs. Elizabeth repositioned herself with a wince. But the leader knew things, mentioned the town council by name, knew about the bridge repair schedule. Inside knowledge, Tall Hawk agreed. But why attack the settlement? Elizabeth reached into her satchel again, producing a folded document. I found this in the schoolhouse after they left. It had fallen behind the stove during the raid. The paper contained a survey map of the canyon and surrounding territories. Red marks indicated mineral deposits, copper primarily, with a vein running directly beneath the settlement. There was talk in town of a railroad spur coming through, Elizabeth explained. If copper was confirmed here, land would become valuable, Tall Hawk finished. And with the settlement abandoned, claims could be filed cheaply by those who knew where to look. Elizabeth's eyes flashed with anger. They weren't just stealing supplies. They were driving people away. A sudden gust rattled the shack's door. Outside, the storm had intensified, wind howling through the canyon like vengeful spirits. The small fire wavered but held. The sheriff must be involved, Elizabeth continued. Jake wouldn't act without his approval. Tall Hawk considered this. Sheriff Davis had served Whispering Pines for 15 years, building a reputation for fairness, though mainly toward the settler population. Would he participate in such a scheme? We need proof beyond a dropped badge, he said. Elizabeth's expression shifted to one of grim satisfaction. I have more. From inside her journal, she extracted several folded pages. While the raiders were loading supplies, I slipped into the leader's saddlebags. These were inside. Letters between Jake and someone named Phillips discussing clearing the settlement and securing the survey results. Tall Hawk examined the letters. The handwriting matched Jake's scrawled reports he'd seen posted at the sheriff's office. Phillips is the sheriff's brother-in-law, he said. Owns the largest ranch outside town. A new sound penetrated the storm's fury, hoofbeats, approaching slowly. Someone had tracked them to the line shack. Tall Hawk extinguished the fire with a handful of dirt, plunging the shack into darkness. We're not alone, he whispered. Through a gap in the shuttered window, they watched as 3 riders approached, faces obscured by rain gear. One dismounted, examining the ground. Tracks lead here, a familiar voice called. 2 people, one limping. Jake Reynolds. We need to move, Tall Hawk said, gathering their belongings. Back door. Elizabeth nodded toward the rear of the shack. It opens onto a drainage gully. As they prepared to flee, Elizabeth tucked the badge and documents securely into her bodice. If anything happens to me, she whispered, make sure these reach the territorial marshal. Tall Hawk's hand found hers in the darkness. Nothing will happen to you. The conviction in his voice belied the danger surrounding them. 3 armed men outside, a wounded woman who could barely walk, a storm that made the canyon treacherous, and a sabotaged bridge standing between them and safety. Yet as Elizabeth's fingers tightened around his, Tall Hawk felt a strange certainty. They would find a way. Together, they slipped out the back of the line shack as Jake's voice ordered the others to surround the building. The drainage gully offered minimal cover, a 4-foot depression snaking away from the structure toward a stand of junipers. Rain had transformed the normally dry channel into a muddy stream. Can you move through water? Tall Hawk asked, supporting Elizabeth's weight. She nodded grimly. I managed worse during Boston winters. The cold water rose to their ankles as they crouched low, following the gully's path. Behind them, The crack of the line shack's door being forced open punctuated the storm's rumble. "They're gone!" Jake's shout carried through the rain. "Check the perimeter!" Tall Hawk guided Elizabeth deeper into the gully where scrub brush provided additional concealment. Her injured leg dragged slightly, leaving a trail in the mud that the rain couldn't completely erase. They needed a solution. "We must bind your leg better," Tall Hawk said when they paused in the shelter of an overhanging rock, "and create a support." From a fallen juniper branch, he crafted a crude splint, carefully carving away the knots and excess bark with his knife. Using strips torn from his own shirt, he bound it firmly to Elizabeth's leg. "This will help distribute weight," he explained. "Less pain, less drag when walking." Elizabeth watched his hands work with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before." "For my father after a hunting accident." Tall Hawk completed the binding with a specialized knot. "He taught me that broken things don't always need to be discarded. Sometimes they can be made stronger at the broken places." The hand-carved splint wouldn't win any beauty contests, but its craftsmanship reflected generations of practical knowledge. When Elizabeth tested her weight on it, her eyes widened in surprise. "It works," she whispered. "The pain is still there, but I can move more easily." A shout from the darkness reminded them of the immediate danger. Jake and his men had found their trail. "We need to reach the bridge," Tall Hawk said. "It's our only way back across." "In this storm," Elizabeth glanced toward the canyon. "You barely crossed it in daylight." "They won't expect it," he replied. "And I know the way now." They moved as quickly as Elizabeth's injury allowed, following the gully until it merged with a game trail leading back toward the canyon rim. The rain had slackened somewhat, but lightning still illuminated the landscape in brilliant flashes, followed by the canyon's echoing response to thunder. When they reached the overlook, the bridge swayed violently in the wind. Sections of repair work Tall Hawk had completed already coming undone. The sight would have deterred most men. But Tall Hawk saw something Elizabeth couldn't, a path made visible by his earlier crossing. "The journey is different when made together," he said, securing the remaining rawhide around his waist. "I will teach you what my father taught me." He demonstrated an Apache breathing technique, 3 short breaths followed by 1 long exhale. "Fear lives in shallow breath. Push it out with the deep ones." Elizabeth mimicked his breathing, her expression gradually calming. "What my students wouldn't give to see their teacher taking instruction," she said with a small smile. The sound of hooves grew louder. Their pursuers were closing in. Tall Hawk helped Elizabeth to the bridge's anchor point, then fashioned a harness that would connect them. "I lead, you follow. Match my steps exactly. If I say freeze, don't move at all." "Tall Hawk," Elizabeth said, clutching his arm. "If we don't make it." He stopped her words by gently placing a finger against her lips. "We will." As they took their first steps onto the battered structure, Elizabeth suddenly stiffened. "Wait," she whispered, pulling her journal from her satchel. She tore out several pages, weighted them with a stone, and placed them conspicuously beside the bridge entrance. "A decoy," she explained. "Let them think we left the evidence behind in our haste." Tall Hawk nodded appreciatively. The schoolteacher has become the tactician. 20 feet out, the bridge protested their combined weight, swinging more dramatically than during Tall Hawk's solo crossing. Elizabeth's breathing quickened, the technique momentarily forgotten. "Look at me," Tall Hawk instructed. "Not down, not at the bridge, at me." Her eyes, wide with fear, found his. In that moment of connection, something passed between them, strength, perhaps, or something deeper. "My father sang when crossing dangerous places," Tall Hawk said, beginning a low chant in Apache. The melody rose and fell like the wind itself, somehow both part of the storm and separate from it. Elizabeth's steps steadied as she focused on the song. When they reached the first major gap, Tall Hawk demonstrated how to transfer weight gradually, testing each repair before committing. "The bridge speaks," he explained. "Listen for creaks that warn. Feel the shudder that says, 'No more weight here.'" They had covered nearly a third of the distance when a shout came from behind. Jake and his men had discovered the decoy and now stood at the canyon edge, illuminated by a flash of lightning. "They're on the bridge." Jake's voice carried over the storm. "Take the long way around. We'll catch them on the other side." One of the men raised a rifle. "No!" Jake knocked the weapon down. "We need them to have an accident. Nothing that raises questions." The brief reprieve wouldn't last long. Jake's men would ride for the canyon pass, hoping to reach the townside before Tall Hawk and Elizabeth completed their crossing. "We must hurry," Tall Hawk said. "But without rushing." Elizabeth nodded, her face set with determination despite the pain and fear. "Lead on." Together they pressed forward, finding their rhythm on the swaying bridge, a dance of balance and trust above the abyss, with the storm as their unwelcome partner. Halfway across the canyon, they encountered nature's warning. A flat stone embedded in the canyon wall, normally dull gray, had turned deep purple with moisture. Tall Hawk recognized it immediately. The storm warning stone his people had used for generations to predict dangerous weather. "Bad sign," he said, pointing to the stone as they paused on a relatively stable section of bridge. Elizabeth gripped the rope supports tighter. "Worse than this current downpour? This is just the messenger." Tall Hawk studied the darkening western sky. "The war chief follows." As if confirming his words, a fresh barrage of lightning illuminated massive thunderheads gathering on the horizon. A second, more powerful storm front approaching. They had reached the section where Tall Hawk had previously detoured to the canyon wall. The pictographs remained visible, glistening with rain. Elizabeth studied them with wonder despite their precarious position. "Your ancestors crossed here," she said, not as a question but a realization. Tall Hawk nodded. "For longer than white men have walked this land." A sudden tremor shook the canyon, dislodging small rocks from the walls. The aftershocks that had threatened earlier were now materializing. The bridge swayed alarmingly, forcing them to cling to the support ropes. "The earth is restless tonight," Tall Hawk said when the shaking subsided. As they carefully continued forward, a flash of movement caught his attention on the far rim. Not Jake's men, who wouldn't have had time to ride around yet, but a figure moving with purpose along the edge. When lightning illuminated the scene again, Tall Hawk recognized the stooped form of Wise Raven. The old medicine man was arranging stones in a pattern. As Tall Hawk watched, Wise Raven struck flint against steel, igniting a small fire despite the rain. The pattern of stones around it formed a traditional Apache signal, one Tall Hawk had learned as a boy. "Danger from the south," he translated. "3 riders." Elizabeth followed his gaze. "Your friend, Wise Raven," Tall Hawk confirmed. "He warns us Jake's men approach from the south trail. They must have split up." Another section of bridge had collapsed completely since his earlier crossing, requiring a new solution. Using his remaining rawhide strips, Tall Hawk created a swing line that would allow them to bypass the gap one at a time. "I go first," he explained. "Then secure the line for you." Elizabeth watched him demonstrate how to use the improvised harness. "My father would have admired this ingenuity," she said. "He built bridges for the Union Army during the war. You never spoke of him before." "Some memories are private until they're needed." Elizabeth's eyes held a new resilience. "He taught me that panicking never solved a problem. Assess, adapt, advance was his motto." Tall Hawk moved across the gap with practiced efficiency, then secured the line for Elizabeth's crossing. As she prepared to follow, another tremor shook the canyon, more violent than the first. A large section of bridge collapsed behind them, splashing into the river below. "No turning back now," Elizabeth observed grimly. She followed Tall Hawk's instructions precisely, sliding across the gap with surprising grace despite her injury. When she reached him, their eyes met in shared accomplishment. "You learn quickly," he said. "I have an excellent teacher." Her hand found his momentarily. "And significant motivation." The next section required careful navigation around broken planks. As they inched forward, Elizabeth reached inside her bodice, ensuring the evidence against Jake remained secure. "If we make it across," she said, "these documents must reach the territorial marshal in Tucson." "When we make it across," Tall Hawk corrected, "I will ensure they do." "There's something you should know," Elizabeth continued, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Among the papers I took from Jake's saddlebag was a land deed with your name on it." Tall Hawk paused, turning to face her fully. "My name, the eastern slope of Hawk's Ridge," she explained. "The document states you sold mineral rights to Phillips Mining Consortium 3 months ago." "I own no land," Tall Hawk said. "Not in white man's terms." "Exactly. It's a forgery. They're using your name because who would believe an Apache claiming otherwise?" He finished, understanding dawning. "Hawk's Ridge holds the aquifer that feeds Whispering Pines. Control the water. Control the town." Tall Hawk nodded. The copper was just the beginning. Another section of bridge gave way behind them as a fresh barrage of rain hammered down. The storm was intensifying, driving sheets of water horizontally across the canyon. Through the deluge, a pinpoint of light appeared on the town side of the canyon, a lantern held high. More lights joined it, bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. "The townsfolk," Elizabeth said. "They've come to watch for us." Indeed, a small crowd had gathered at the canyon edge despite the dangerous weather. Among them, Tall Hawk spotted Peter Williams, the storekeeper who had provided supplies for his crossing. Their presence created a new urgency. If Jake's men reached the townside first, they might prevent anyone from helping once Tall Hawk and Elizabeth completed the crossing. "We must hurry," Tall Hawk said, turning his attention to the final third of their journey. The most treacherous section lay ahead, where the bridge had suffered the worst damage and where his earlier repairs had likely been undone by the storm. Beyond that gauntlet waited Jake's men, racing to intercept them before they could share what they knew. Elizabeth adjusted her splinted leg and nodded. "Lead on." Behind them, the collapsed bridge sections floated away downriver, removing any possibility of retreat. Above, the storm warning stone had deepened to nearly black, the darkest omen possible. The final section of bridge hung like a broken spine across the canyon. Lightning revealed the challenge ahead, gaps where entire sections had vanished, support ropes frayed to mere threads, and wooden slats twisted by wind and water. The storm had reached its full fury, driving rain and hail in stinging sheets. Elizabeth reached inside her collar and withdrew a small silver locket on a delicate chain. She opened it briefly, showing Tall Hawk its contents. A tiny photograph of a uniformed man on one side, and on the other, a small medicine bundle he recognized as one he had once given her. "My husband Thomas," she explained, closing the locket and securing it again. "And your gift. I carry both my past and my hope." She tucked the locket safely away. For luck. They were less than 100 yards from the townside now, but it might as well have been 100 miles. Every foot would be a battle against the elements and the deteriorating structure. "We cross together from here," Tall Hawk decided, "side by side where possible." The technique wasn't traditional, but instinct told him their combined weight, properly distributed, might actually stabilize certain sections. Elizabeth nodded, understanding without explanation. They moved as one entity, finding a rhythm that accounted for her injured leg. When a board cracked beneath Tall Hawk's weight, Elizabeth was positioned to offer support. When her splinted leg caught between slats, he freed it without breaking stride. Halfway through this final gauntlet, hoofbeats thundered above the storm's voice. 3 riders appeared on the town side of the canyon, Jake's men, having completed their journey around the canyon's southern route. They dismounted quickly, conferring with urgency as they spotted the figures on the bridge. "They're alive," one shouted, pointing. "Not for long," another replied, drawing a rifle. The third man, Jake himself, recognizable even at a distance, knocked the rifle down. "I told you, nothing that looks deliberate." The brief exchange carried across the canyon, audible in a momentary lull in the storm. The townsfolk who had gathered to watch began to stir with confusion. "Did you hear that?" someone called out. Jake turned, suddenly aware of the witnesses. He forced a smile, raising his voice. Thank God they're alive. We rode around to help. But his performance came too late. The gap between his private words and public declaration hung in the air like gunsmoke. On the bridge, Elizabeth and Tall Hawk faced a massive gap, the largest yet. At least 15 feet of missing structure separated them from the final approach. We can't jump it, Elizabeth said, assessing the distance with her teacher's precision. No, Tall Hawk agreed. We must build it. Using the last of his rawhide, Tall Hawk began constructing a rope bridge within the bridge, a spider's web of support lines anchored to the remaining sound elements of the structure. Each knot was a testament to knowledge passed down through generations of Apache travelers. As he worked, Elizabeth kept watch on Jake and his men, who had begun moving toward the bridge entrance. They're coming, she warned. Tall Hawk tied the final knot and tested the improvised span. It flexed alarmingly but held. This will support one person at a time, he said. You cross first. Elizabeth shook her head firmly. They want you dead more than me. I'll be the distraction. Before he could protest, she had taken the evidence from her bodice and pressed it into his hands. Get this to the marshal, she insisted. I'll follow. For a moment, Tall Hawk saw her not as the refined schoolteacher but as a frontier woman of remarkable courage. Without further argument, he secured the documents in his medicine pouch. Count to 20 after I start across, he instructed. Not before. He began navigating the makeshift span, moving with deliberate speed. The rawhide stretched beneath his weight but remained intact, a testament to both the material and the traditional knowledge that had prepared it. Near the town side, a new figure had appeared among the gathered crowd, Wise Raven, somehow having circled around unseen. The old medicine man had positioned himself between Jake's approach and the bridge entrance. Several other Apache men from the hills had joined him, a silent barrier of resistance. Tall Hawk reached the far side of the improvised section, then turned back toward Elizabeth. Now, he called. She began her crossing with surprising agility, her splinted leg barely slowing her progress. The rawhide creaked but supported her lighter weight even more effectively. Jake had reached the bridge entrance but found his path blocked by Wise Raven and the others. Move aside, old man, he demanded. The bridge welcomes those who respect its spirit, Wise Raven replied calmly. It rejects those who bring dishonor. As if in response to his words, a tremendous crack echoed through the canyon. A support beam near Jake splintered and fell away into the abyss. He jumped back, momentarily startled. Elizabeth had nearly completed her crossing of the gap when disaster struck. A lightning bolt hit the canyon wall directly above, sending a shower of rocks onto the bridge. One struck the rawhide line, fraying it instantly. Jump! Tall Hawk shouted. Elizabeth launched herself forward as the line gave way beneath her. For a heart-stopping moment, she hung suspended over the chasm, arms outstretched. Tall Hawk lunged, catching her wrists in an iron grip. With a tremendous effort, he pulled her to safety as the improvised span collapsed into the canyon below. They lay on the creaking boards, rain washing over them, breath coming in gasps. Only 30 feet now separated them from the townside and from Jake. Almost home, Elizabeth whispered. Tall Hawk helped her to her feet. Almost to the next beginning, he corrected. The final 30 feet of bridge felt more solid than anything they had crossed thus far. Tall Hawk suspected this section had been deliberately left intact, the better to maintain the illusion that the bridge's failure was natural, not sabotage. As they approached the townside, the gathered crowd grew more distinct. Peter Williams stood at the forefront, lantern held high. Sheriff Davis had arrived as well, his expression unreadable as he observed both the returning pair and his deputy. Stand aside, Jake called to Wise Raven and his companions. I'm an officer of the law. You're a thief of more than goods, Wise Raven replied, his voice carrying despite his years. A thief of trust, a thief of truth. Jake's hand moved toward his gun. The tension crackled like the lightning overhead. Tall Hawk and Elizabeth reached the end of the bridge. Only a few feet of wooden planking separated them from solid ground and from Jake. Behind them, the storm-ravaged structure creaked and swayed, sections still falling away into the canyon depths. "Miss Winters," Sheriff Davis called out. "Thank God you're alive. We received word of trouble at the settlement." "Trouble indeed, Sheriff," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite exhaustion. "Trouble that followed us back across the bridge." She reached into her sodden dress pocket and withdrew a folded paper that had survived their journey, the land deed with Tall Hawk's forged signature, the document that connected everything. "What's that?" the sheriff asked. "Evidence," Elizabeth said, "of a conspiracy involving your deputy, Mr. Phillips, and possibly others." Jake's face contorted with rage. "She's delirious from her injury, Sheriff. The Apache has filled her head with lies." "Let her speak," Peter Williams demanded, stepping forward. Other townsfolk murmured in agreement, their curiosity overcoming their usual deference to authority. Elizabeth held up the document, protected from the rain by Peter's lantern. "This deed shows land belonging to Tall Hawk sold to Phillips Mining Consortium. Land he never owned in white man's terms, and certainly never sold." "So? A misunderstanding," Jake shrugged, though his eyes remained fixed on the paper. "A forgery," Elizabeth corrected. "One of many crimes committed to secure the copper deposits beneath the settlement and the water rights on Hawk's Ridge." From his medicine pouch, Tall Hawk produced the remaining evidence: the deputy's badge found at the settlement and the letters between Jake and Phillips. Sheriff Davis took the items, examining them with growing consternation. "Jake? What is this?" The deputy's composure cracked. "Progress requires sacrifice, Sheriff. The territory's future isn't with small settlements and backward thinking. Phillips has connections to the railroad, to Eastern investors. This whole county could prosper. By terrorizing innocent families? By destroying the bridge." The sheriff's voice rose with anger. "By murder. No one was supposed to die," Jake protested. "Just scared enough to abandon worthless land that happens to sit on top of the richest copper vein in the territory." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, faces hardening as the truth emerged. Jake sensed the turning tide. In a desperate move, he lunged toward Elizabeth, grabbing for the deed she held. "Give me that." Tall Hawk moved with the speed that had made him the tribe's most valued hunter. His arm blocked Jake's advance, then swept the deputy's legs from beneath him. Jake crashed to the muddy ground, his gun spinning away. "You'd take the word of an Apache over mine?" Jake snarled, scrambling backward. "Have you all lost your minds?" Tall Hawk stood perfectly still, making no move to pursue. "I speak truth. The canyon bears witness. The bridge bears witness. The bridge is just wood and rope," Jake spat. "No," Elizabeth said. "It's a path between worlds, between what we were and what we might become." One of Jake's men made a move toward his weapon. In response, Wise Raven gave a signal that sent his Apache companions spreading into strategic positions around the crowd. Not threatening, but unmistakably present. Sheriff Davis had seen enough. "Jake Reynolds, you're under arrest for conspiracy, destruction of property, and attempted murder." He turned to the other riders. "You men too." "You can't prove anything," Jake protested. From the back of the crowd, a new voice spoke. "Actually, he can." The territorial marshal stepped forward, having arrived unnoticed during the confrontation. "I've been investigating Phillips and his operation for months. These documents are the final pieces I needed." As the marshal took custody of Jake and his conspirators, the crowd's attention returned to the true heroes of the night. Elizabeth stood tall despite her injury, the schoolteacher's dignity undiminished by her ordeal. Beside her, Tall Hawk's presence seemed to have transformed in the townsfolk's eyes, no longer the outsider but a man who had risked everything to save one of their own. "You crossed that bridge when everyone said it couldn't be done," Peter Williams said, approaching them. "When we all called you crazy for trying." "Some bridges must be crossed," Tall Hawk replied simply, "even when they appear broken beyond repair." Elizabeth's hand found his, fingers intertwining openly now, heedless of the watching crowd. Some crossings change more than just your location, she added softly. Around them, the storm was finally beginning to subside. The first faint stars appeared between parting clouds, like distant lanterns guiding travelers home. Dawn broke over whispering pines with the cleansed feeling that follows a powerful storm. The town had awakened to a changed landscape, not just the physical terrain with its debris-strewn streets and water-carved gullies, but the invisible boundaries that had defined their community. On the porch of the doctor's house, Tall Hawk sat patiently while Elizabeth's leg wound was properly treated and bandaged. The doctor had declared she would heal completely, given time and rest, neither of which, Tall Hawk suspected, Elizabeth would accept in large measure. The children from the settlement arrived safely at Fort Reconciliation, Sheriff Davis reported, joining them on the porch. The lawman looked older this morning, the betrayal of his deputy weighing heavily on him. The army's sending supplies and escorts to bring them back once we have proper accommodations ready. They'll need a school, Elizabeth said, emerging from the doctor's office with a proper crutch replacing Tall Hawk's improvised splint. And a teacher. You still want to teach here? After everything? The sheriff asked, genuine surprise in his voice. More than ever, Elizabeth replied. Though I believe we need a school that serves all children, including those from the Apache camps. The statement hung in the air, bold, challenging, yet offered with such matter-of-fact confidence that it seemed an inevitable conclusion rather than a radical proposal. Tall Hawk remained silent, though his eyes never left Elizabeth's face. He had seen her courage on the bridge, but this different kind of bravery impressed him equally. Peter Williams approached, carrying a rolled parchment tied with string. Town council met at first light, he announced. Thought you might want to see what we've been discussing. He unrolled the parchment on the porch railing. It contained a detailed drawing, a blueprint for a new bridge spanning the canyon. This design was more substantial than its predecessor, with stone supports and a wider crossing. We're calling it the Friendship Bridge, Peter explained. Strong enough to connect both communities properly. Tall Hawk studied the drawing, noting the incorporation of both traditional engineering and elements that resembled Apache construction techniques. Who designed this? I remembered some of what my brother taught me, Peter admitted. And Wise Raven contributed ideas from your people's methods. Said something about bridges being strongest when they draw from many traditions. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it was sincere. Elizabeth's hand found Tall Hawk's as they examined the plans together. The territorial governor's office has offered funds, Sheriff Davis added. Seems they're keen to make amends for not catching Philip's scheme sooner. They're sending engineers next month. And in the meantime? Elizabeth asked. In the meantime, the sheriff replied, Tall Hawk has been asked to serve as official liaison between Whispering Pines and the Apache camps, with compensation from the territorial government. Tall Hawk looked up in surprise. Such a position would be unprecedented, an acknowledgement of his place in both worlds. The council also voted to establish the school Elizabeth mentioned, Peter added, on the condition she agrees to be its teacher. Elizabeth's smile brightened the morning. I accept, though I'll need help with languages I don't speak. Her meaning was clear. This would be a partnership in more ways than one. As the men departed to continue the town's recovery efforts, Elizabeth and Tall Hawk found themselves alone on the porch. The morning sun warmed their faces after the long, cold night. What will your people think? She asked softly. About all of this? Some will embrace it, he answered honestly. Others will need time. Change comes harder to those who have lost much already. And Wise Raven? Tall Hawk smiled slightly. He told me long ago that bridges are more than wood and rope. They are promises made solid. Later that morning, they stood together at the canyon's edge, looking across to the settlement where their journey had begun. The ruined bridge hung below like a reminder of the fragile nature of connections. They called you crazy, Elizabeth said, for trying to cross that crumbling bridge. Perhaps I was, Tall Hawk admitted. But some kinds of madness are worth embracing. In the distance, they could see riders from Fort Reconciliation approaching, the children returning, the settlement to be rebuilt. Behind them in town, the sounds of repair and renewal filled the air. And between them, something neither had expected to find in this harsh territory, a connection stronger than any bridge of human construction. "What do we build first?" Elizabeth asked, gesturing toward the future that opened before them. Tall Hawk considered the canyon, the towns on either side, and the woman beside him. "We have already laid the foundation," he said. "Now we build upon it, one plank at a time." 2 days after the storm, Tall Hawk climbed the winding path to Wise Raven's dwelling on the eastern ridge. The old medicine man had returned to his solitary home after the events at the canyon, declining the town's offers of gratitude with a gentle wave of his gnarled hand. Tall Hawk found him seated outside his modest shelter, carefully packing tobacco into an elaborately carved pipe, an artifact passed down through 7 generations of medicine men. The sacred pipe had witnessed treaty signings, war councils, and healing ceremonies throughout the troubled history between Apache and settler. "I knew you would come," Wise Raven said without looking up. "The spirits told me the bridge builder would seek counsel." Tall Hawk sat cross-legged opposite his mentor, accepting the customary silence that preceded important conversations. The old man completed his ritual preparation of the pipe, tamping the tobacco with practiced precision. "You crossed the impossible bridge," Wise Raven said finally, looking up with eyes that remained sharp despite his years. "And in doing so, you began to build another." "The town speaks of a new physical bridge," Tall Hawk replied. "Stone and timber to replace what was lost." Wise Raven lit the pipe, drew deeply, and passed it to Tall Hawk. "I speak of the bridge between hearts, between worlds that have remained separate too long." Tall Hawk accepted the pipe, honored by the sharing of sacred tobacco. Among their people, such an offering represented the connection between earth and sky, between human and spirit, between past and future. "The elders may not approve," Tall Hawk said after returning the pipe. "Many still remember the broken promises, the stolen lands. The elders remember what must not be forgotten," Wise Raven acknowledged. "But memory that serves only pain becomes a prison." He gestured toward the valley where whispering pines lay. "The settler woman. She carries different memories, different pain, yet she seeks a new path." "Elizabeth," Tall Hawk said, the name itself feeling like a bridge between his Apache identity and the world beyond. "She has a good spirit," the old man observed. "When I looked in her eyes at the canyon's edge, I saw respect, not fear, curiosity, not judgment." From a leather pouch, Wise Raven withdrew a small bundle of sage, adding it to the pipe's embers. The aromatic smoke curled between them, carrying prayers upward. "My father taught me to read signs," Tall Hawk said. "Tracks in soil, weather in clouds, intention in eyes. But he did not teach me how to walk in 2 worlds at once." "Because he could not," Wise Raven replied simply. "Each generation must find its own crossing." The old man reached behind him and brought forth a rolled deerskin. When opened, it revealed a detailed map drawn in natural pigments, the territories as the Apache knew them, marked with sacred sites, hunting grounds, and water sources. "Our people have always been pathfinders," Wise Raven said, his finger tracing ancient migration routes. "When others saw only barriers, we found passages. When others saw only danger, we found opportunity." He pointed to the canyon where Tall Hawk had made his crossing. "This place has witnessed crossings for 1,000 years. Long before the white man's bridge, our ancestors found ways. Sometimes by rope, sometimes by narrow hidden trails, sometimes by jumping where the gap was narrowest." "Like the pictographs showed," Tall Hawk nodded. "Yes, but the greatest crossings were not of canyons, but of understanding." Wise Raven tapped his chest. "The hardest journeys happen here." The old man carefully re-rolled the map and set it aside. "The town has asked you to be a bridge between peoples. This is good. But remember that a bridge allows travel in both directions. You must bring our wisdom to them, but also bring their knowledge to us." "Some will resist," Tall Hawk said. "Of course," Wise Raven chuckled. "Resistance is the first response to any new path." Even water resists a new channel before it learns to flow there. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the medicine man shared stories Tall Hawk had never heard. Accounts of Apache scouts who had worked with settlers in earlier times, of friendships formed across cultural boundaries, of knowledge exchanged that benefited both peoples. These stories are not often told, Wise Raven explained, because pain speaks louder than hope, but they are true nonetheless. When Tall Hawk finally rose to leave, the old man pressed something into his palm, a small stone carving of a bridge spanning a canyon. "My grandfather made this," Wise Raven said, after a dream about a time when the divide between peoples would begin to close. "Perhaps he saw you." Tall Hawk closed his fingers around the carving, feeling its smooth contours and the weight of its meaning. "The crossing you made was dangerous," the old man said as farewell. "But the one you begin now requires even greater courage. Remember, the strongest bridges are built by those willing to stand where nothing yet exists." The doctor had ordered Elizabeth to rest her injured leg for at least a week, advice she followed with reluctant compliance. On the third day of her confinement, she sat on the boarding house porch, watching the town's rebuilding efforts while organizing papers for her proposed school. Tall Hawk found her there, surrounded by books and notes, her wounded leg propped on a cushioned stool. She looked up at his approach, her smile immediate and unguarded. "The perfect patient, I see," he observed, nodding toward the scattered work materials. "Planning is hardly exertion," she countered. "Besides, the school won't organize itself." He presented her with a small bundle of canyon wildflowers, not the showy blooms settlers typically favored, but the hardy, medicinal plants that thrived in harsh conditions. She accepted them with appreciation, recognizing several she had learned about during their earlier encounters. "These will make a fine tea for healing," she said, identifying each correctly. As she arranged the plants, Tall Hawk noticed a faded photograph partially hidden beneath her papers. Elizabeth followed his gaze and withdrew the image, a formal portrait of a well-dressed family standing before an imposing Boston mansion. A younger Elizabeth stood between an austere gentleman and an elegant woman, their rigid postures contrasting with the city's grandeur visible through the window behind them. "My former life," she explained, handing him the photograph. "Before the war, before Thomas, before everything changed." Tall Hawk studied the image carefully. The young woman in the photograph wore the same face as Elizabeth, yet somehow seemed a stranger. Her expression contained a certainty that experience had since tempered with wisdom. "Elizabeth Harrington," she said, tracing the edge of the photograph. "Daughter of Judge William Harrington, graduate of the Kensington Academy for Young Ladies, engaged to the son of her father's business partner." A small, wry smile crossed her face. A life planned down to the last detail. "What happened?" Tall Hawk asked, returning the photograph. "I met Thomas Winters, an idealistic young lawyer working for my father. When the war came, he enlisted immediately." Her fingers traced the worn edges of the photograph. "We married against my parents' wishes the day before he left for the front." She reached for her locket, the one containing both Thomas's image and Tall Hawk's medicine bundle, and opened it briefly. 6 months later, he was gone. Antietam, the famous battle name, hung in the air between them. Even in Apache camps, they had heard of the terrible day when more Americans died than in any other battle in their history. "My parents expected me to return to the fold," Elizabeth continued. "Resume the life they had planned, perhaps marry someone of their choosing." She closed the locket with a decisive click. "Instead, I used Thomas's pension to attend teachers' college. And then came West," Tall Hawk finished. "Everyone thought I was running away," she said. "Perhaps I was at first. Boston held too many ghosts, too many expectations. I chose the furthest teaching post available, a small mining town in Arizona Territory." "Whispering Pines," Tall Hawk nodded. "Actually, no. Silver Creek, 50 miles north. I lasted 3 months before the mine closed and the town emptied." A hint of mischief entered her expression. "Rather than return east in defeat, I simply moved to the next town requiring a teacher." Tall Hawk could imagine her determination, this Boston-bred woman navigating the harsh realities of frontier life through sheer will. "The first winter nearly broke me," she admitted. "Everything was so immediate, so unforgiving. I had never experienced such cold, such isolation. Yet you stayed." "Yes, because that same winter, I discovered something unexpected." Her eyes met his directly. "Freedom. The very harshness that tested me also burned away pretense. Out here, one's background matters less than one's actions. One's character reveals itself through choices, not pedigrees." From her portfolio, Elizabeth withdrew another item, a letter on expensive stationery, the Boston address embossed in gold. "My parents still write occasionally, urging my return to civilization. Their last letter came just before I left for the settlement." She handed him the letter, an unusual gesture of trust. Tall Hawk read it slowly, his reading skills sufficient to grasp the elegant, concerned phrasing that masked rigid disapproval. "They worry for you," he observed, returning the letter. "They worry for the daughter they once controlled," Elizabeth corrected gently. "But that young woman no longer exists. She began disappearing the day Thomas died, and completed her transformation somewhere between Boston and here. She gathered her papers, organizing them with practiced efficiency. I came west believing I was leaving everything behind. Instead, I found what I hadn't known I was seeking." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch. In the street beyond, townspeople continued repairs from the storm, their community already adapting to new realities. "And what was that?" Tall Hawk asked. Elizabeth's hand briefly touched his, the gesture both answer and question. "A place where bridges, once built, can lead to unexpected destinations." A week after the canyon crossing, Territorial Marshal James Hargrove called a town meeting in Whispering Pines. The gathering took place in the town's small church, the only building large enough to accommodate both townsfolk and the representatives from nearby Apache camps who had been specifically invited. At the front of the room, displayed on a simple wooden stand, rested an official-looking document, a peace treaty scroll bearing the territorial governor's seal alongside marks from Apache leaders. The parchment represented decades of broken promises and tenuous arrangements, yet remained the framework for relations between settlers and indigenous peoples. "This document," Marshal Hargrove began, his voice carrying to the back of the crowded room, "is supposed to guarantee fair treatment and clear boundaries between settler communities and Apache territories." The marshal was a straight-talking man in his 50s, his face weathered by years of frontier service. "We all know its provisions have been honored inconsistently at best." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. On one side sat the townsfolk, on the other the Apache representatives, with a visible gap between them, a physical manifestation of the divide the recent events had begun to bridge. "The Phillips conspiracy exposed deeper problems in our territorial administration," Hargrove continued. "Officials turning blind eyes to land grabs, selective enforcement of treaty provisions, and willful ignorance of Apache rights." In the front row, Tall Hawk sat beside Elizabeth, whose leg was healing well enough to allow her to attend. Behind them, Sheriff Davis and Peter Williams represented the town leadership. Across the aisle, Wise Raven and 3 other Apache elders listened with cautious attention. "The governor has authorized me to implement new oversight measures," the marshal explained, "starting with proper documentation of land boundaries according to the original treaty terms." He unrolled a map across a table, weighing its corners with stones. "This shows the territory as currently recognized by territorial authorities." Wise Raven rose slowly, approaching the map with dignified deliberation. He studied it, then spoke in carefully measured English. "This boundary line," he said, pointing to the western edge of the designated Apache territory, "cuts through sacred ground where our ancestors have been laid to rest for 10 generations. The marshal nodded. "That's precisely the type of discrepancy we need to address. The original treaty specifically protected burial grounds." A rancher at the back called out, "Are you saying we need to give land back?" "I'm saying," the marshal replied evenly, "that we need to honor existing agreements before making new ones. The territory's reputation and future development depend on establishing trust. Elizabeth raised her hand. When acknowledged, she stood, leaning slightly on her cane. History will judge us by how we treat those with whom we share this land. The Apache were here long before any of us arrived. Easy for a schoolteacher to say, another voice objected. You don't have livestock depending on that grazing land. Actually, Sheriff Davis interjected, proper boundaries might prevent the cattle raids that have plagued ranches along disputed territories. Most conflicts arise from confusion over where one claim ends and another begins. Tall Hawk had remained silent, observing the dynamics with careful attention. Now he rose, conscious of all eyes turning toward him. My people remember when no lines marked the land, he said. We followed game, water, seasons. The earth belonged to no one and everyone. He paused, allowing his words to settle. Those days are gone. Now we must learn to live within lines drawn on paper. But these lines should reflect truth, not convenience. Respect, not opportunity. His gaze swept the room, meeting eyes on both sides of the divide. The bridge that spans the canyon can teach us. It connects separate places without changing what they are. It allows passage without requiring surrender. Wise Raven nodded almost imperceptibly, approval in his aged eyes. Marshal Hargrove reclaimed the floor. What happened at the canyon exposed corruption, but also revealed possibility. Mr. Tall Hawk's appointment as official liaison is just the beginning. He gestured toward the treaty document. We have the framework. What we've lacked is the will to honor it fully. As the meeting progressed into specific proposals, Tall Hawk observed the subtle shifts in the room. Some settlers and Apache representatives had begun to drift closer together, the invisible barrier between them softening as they examined the maps and discussed boundary issues. Elizabeth leaned close to whisper, change comes slowly, but it does come. Outside the church windows, construction had begun on the new bridge. The rhythmic sound of hammers provided a backdrop to the discussions within, building connections both physical and social, plank by careful plank. The peace treaty scroll remained on display throughout the meeting, a reminder of promises made, broken, and perhaps, finally, to be honored. The parchment itself wasn't as important as the principles it represented. Respect for boundaries, acknowledgement of rights, and the possibility that different peoples could share a territory without surrendering their essential identities. As the gathering concluded, Tall Hawk knew the path ahead would not be smooth. Generations of mistrust could not be erased by a single heroic act or a well-intentioned meeting. But bridges, once begun, made previously impossible journeys conceivable. And some journeys, once deemed crazy to attempt, became the very passages that defined a community's future. 2 weeks after the town meeting, with construction of the new bridge progressing steadily, Elizabeth's school proposal had been approved. The town council offered use of the old meeting hall until a proper schoolhouse could be built. Her first challenge was preparing a curriculum that would serve both settler and Apache children. One morning, Tall Hawk arrived at the meeting hall to find Elizabeth surrounded by books, maps, and an unusual collection spread across a large table. A carefully arranged display of pressed plants, each labeled with both English and Apache names. The Canyon Flora collection represented hours of collaboration between them, combining her systematic documentation with his traditional knowledge. The children will learn the land first, Elizabeth explained, gesturing to the collection. Before reading, before numbers, they must understand where they live. Tall Hawk examined her work with appreciation. Each specimen had been carefully preserved between sheets of parchment, the colors still vibrant enough to identify. Desert sage, prickly pear, canyon lily, juniper, yucca. Plants that had sustained his people for generations alongside newer arrivals like the Russian thistle that had arrived with settler wagons. The canyon teaches patience, he observed, touching a pressed clefrose blossom. These plants survive where others would surrender. Elizabeth nodded. That's precisely the lesson I want the children to understand. This isn't just botany, it's philosophy. She showed him her teaching notes, which paired plant characteristics with life lessons. The deep-rooted mesquite demonstrated perseverance. The water-storing barrel cactus taught preparation. The cliff-clinging columbine illustrated adaptation to challenging circumstances. My Boston colleagues would be scandalized, she laughed. Science and moral instruction were never to intermingle. Your Boston colleagues never lived where survival and wisdom are the same lesson, Tall Hawk replied. Together they continued organizing the collection, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked. The casual intimacy that had developed between them still surprised him. How naturally they had fallen into a partnership that transcended cultural boundaries. I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting, Elizabeth said as they completed the arrangement. About the bridge connecting places without changing what they are. What of it? The canyon itself is like that, she said, her teacher's mind drawing connections. It separates and connects simultaneously. The same river that carved the division created the fertile soil on both sides. Tall Hawk considered this. The Apache have always seen the canyon as a living entity, not an obstacle. Provides shelter from winter winds, traps water. For springs, creates unique growing conditions for medicine plants. Yet settlers viewed it only as a barrier to be conquered, Elizabeth mused. Different eyes see different truths in the same landscape, Tall Hawk agreed. From his medicine pouch, he withdrew a small leather-bound journal, his own project these past days. Opening it revealed detailed sketches of canyon wildlife. The desert bighorn sheep that traversed seemingly impossible cliffs, the peregrine falcons that nested in high crevices, the elusive mountain lions whose prints he occasionally tracked. For your school, he explained, somewhat self-consciously. Drawing was not a skill his people traditionally valued, but Elizabeth had encouraged his natural talent. She accepted the journal with evident delight. This is perfect. The children need to understand they share this land with creatures who knew it long before humans arrived. My grandfather taught that we borrow the land from eagles and return it when we pass, Tall Hawk said. Our claim is temporary. Theirs is eternal. The afternoon sun streamed through the meeting hall windows as they continued preparing the classroom. Outside, the sounds of construction at the canyon bridge punctuated their conversation. Hammers striking nails, saws biting wood, voices calling measurements and instructions. The canyon has witnessed so much, Elizabeth reflected. Geological ages, ancient peoples, conflicts, crossings, and now, perhaps, a new kind of community. If we listen to what it teaches, Tall Hawk agreed. When their work was completed, they stepped outside to find the afternoon cooling toward evening. Without discussion, they walked together toward the canyon rim, drawn to the landscape that had become central to their shared story. The construction crews had departed for the day, leaving the partially completed bridge silent in the fading light. Below, the river continued its ancient passage, carving infinitesimally deeper with each passing year. Above, hawks circled on thermal currents, their keen eyes witnessing the human activities with indifferent attention. We think we change the land, Tall Hawk observed, but mostly, it changes us. Elizabeth's hand found his as they stood at the edge, looking out over the living canyon that had nearly claimed their lives and, in doing so, had given them something neither had expected to find in this harsh territory. The best teachers often are the most demanding, she replied, the educator in her recognizing the profound truth in his observation. As twilight deepened the canyon shadows, they remained at the rim, two figures from different worlds united by respect for the ancient landscape that had become the foundation for their unlikely bridge. The seasons turned with the steady rhythm that had marked this land long before human eyes witnessed it. Summer heat gave way to autumn's golden touch, then winter's brief chill, and finally spring's renewal. Through each change, the new bridge grew more substantial, no longer a desperate crossing but a deliberate connection. On the day of its official opening, a document of another kind was presented to the gathered communities. The town charter amendment, bound in leather and bearing the territorial seal, formalized what had begun with one man's crossing of a crumbling span. Equal rights and representation for Apache people within Whispering Pines governance, unprecedented in the territory and viewed with skepticism by many officials. Some said it couldn't be done, Peter Williams remarked, standing beside Tall Hawk as the ribbon was cut at the bridge's center. Just like they said you were crazy to cross that bridge during the storm. The crossing was the easy part, Tall Hawk replied, watching as children from both communities raced across the new structure, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Building what comes after, that is the true challenge. Elizabeth joined them, her classroom primer tucked under one arm. The school had flourished beyond expectation, with children from the settlement and Apache camps learning side by side. Her methods had raised eyebrows among traditional educators, but the results spoke for themselves. They're calling it the Whispering Pines Experiment in Tucson, she said, nodding toward a newspaper reporter sketching the scene, as if mutual respect were some radical notion. For some it is, Tall Hawk acknowledged. Change comes harder than crossing canyons for those who fear losing what they've always known. The celebration continued into evening, with food and music from both cultures sharing space at the same tables. Wise Raven, now moving more slowly but his eyes still sharp, observed from a seat of honor near the fire. You have built more than you know, the old man told Tall Hawk when he approached. Long after this wooden bridge has weathered away, the other crossing will remain. As darkness fell, Marshal Hargrove stepped forward with a final announcement. The territorial governor had approved naming the pass Reconciliation Canyon, in recognition of the unique cooperation that had flourished there. Later, when most had departed and only embers remained of the celebration fires, Tall Hawk and Elizabeth stood alone at the center of the bridge. Below, the river continued its ancient journey, indifferent to the human dramas that played out above its waters. I received a letter from Boston yesterday, Elizabeth said, breaking their comfortable silence. My parents are coming to visit in the autumn. Are you concerned? Tall Hawk asked, knowing how strained those relationships remained. She smiled, the moonlight catching the silver that had begun appearing at her temples. No, they will see what I've found here or they won't. Either way, I know my path. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. The gold band on her finger caught the moonlight, a simple circle that had caused considerable conversation when they had exchanged vows 6 months earlier. What our children and grandchildren will build on this foundation, that is what matters now, she said. The thought of future generations crossing bridges not yet imagined filled Tall Hawk with quiet hope. Already their first child grew beneath Elizabeth's heart, a new life that would know both worlds as birthright rather than division. Crazy, he mused, the word that had once been hurled as mockery now worn as a badge of honor in the community. They still say it sometimes, crazy enough to cross that bridge. It's become quite the expression around here, Elizabeth agreed. I heard Mrs. Peterson use it yesterday when her son decided to court the blacksmith's daughter. They shared a smile at how their story had transformed into local idiom, a shorthand for courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds. In the years that followed, the bridge witnessed many crossings, literal and metaphorical. Children grew into adults who knew no world where the communities lived divided. Tall Hawk and Elizabeth's own children moved easily between cultures, carrying forward the legacy their parents had begun. And when grandchildren eventually gathered at their feet, the story they requested most often was the one about the storm, the canyon, and the broken bridge that one man had been crazy enough to cross. Tell us again, they would plead, eyes wide with wonder at a time they could barely imagine. And so the tale would be retold, growing slightly in the telling as all good stories do, but never losing the essential truth at its heart, that the most important bridges are built by those willing to attempt the impossible crossing.